The following is a presentation of Muddy River News.
Doctor, if you would come before the clerk and raise your right hand, please.
You do solemnly swear that the testimony you may give in the cause now pending before this court shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God? Yes. You may be seated.
Doctor, please feel free to adjust that microphone. There you go. All right, you may inquire, Mr. Barnum.
Thank you, Judge. Doctor, would you introduce yourself to the ladies and gentlemen of the jury by telling them your full name?
Hi, I'm Dr. Juliet Scandalbury.
Doctor, what is your profession?
I'm an assistant medical examiner
Where?
at West Tennessee Regional Forensic Center with the University of Tennessee.
Where is that facility, the West Central or Western?
Memphis, Tennessee.
Memphis, Tennessee. And in that regard, you said you are an assistant medical examiner. Are you a licensed physician?
I am.
Okay. And do you have a specialty within the medical profession?
Yes.
What is your specialty?
I'm a forensic pathologist.
I brought you here to share with the juries some opinions you have expressed in the form of an autopsy report. But before we do that, I want you to share with the ladies and gentlemen of the jury when you obtained your medical degree.
2009.
And where did you obtain your degree from?
Howard University College of Medicine.
And where is that located?
Howard University. Pardon me?
It's in Washington, D.C., is it not?
Yes.
Okay. Doctor, once you graduated from medical school, describe for the folks on the jury your training, your specialty training that led you to the field of forensic pathology.
So I did my residency at Washington University in St. Louis for anatomic and clinical pathology. And after that, I did my forensic pathology fellowship at St. Louis University.
When did you complete that fellowship?
At 2014.
In terms of your professional work as a forensic pathologist, can you share with us that progression where you practice forensic pathology leading up to today?
Yes. From, say, 2013 to March of 2019, I was at St. Louis University as a fellow. Then I was an attending. I was taking part in the fellowship program, training fellows. And then from there, starting April 2019 to current, I'm at University of Tennessee. I'm an assistant medical examiner and also the assistant forensic pathology fellowship director.
All right.
Amongst other things.
That's a lot. Can you tell us, describe for us what the subspecialty of forensic pathology is within the practice of medicine?
So is the medical legal application of medicine where I assess the body to determine the cause and manner of death.
Cause and manner. Those are two different words. Let's define each of those. Cause of death. When you talk about that, what does that mean for you as a forensic pathologist? What are you trying to determine?
The ultimate reason why someone died.
Okay. And when you use the term manner of death, can you tell us what that means within the context of your professional opinions or findings?
Is essentially the circumstances around the reason why they died.
Okay. Now, two things. Number one, I know that you have a long way to travel after we finish, so I may kind of speed this along with my apologies, but there are some things we need to cover. Doctor, in the course of doing that work, trying to determine the cause and manner of death, do you perform procedures on the bodies of deceased individuals?
I do.
What is that called?
An autopsy?
And how many autopsies have you performed in the course of your work as a forensic pathologist?
I've lost track, but it's
Yeah.
over 1,000 at this point.
Over 1,000?
Yes.
All right. Doctor, I want to ask you some general questions, and then we're going to focus in on the circumstances of your examination of the body of Ariana Hoff. Okay?
Yes.
And Mr. Barnard, and you may be already planning on this, but before getting to her opinions, I want to give Mr. Nelson an opportunity to ask questions about qualifications.
Absolutely.
So, okay, thank you.
Describe for us in a general way, Dr. Scantlebury, what kind of baseline information a forensic pathologist will normally have or want to have before you begin your work in performing an autopsy?
Essentially, I need to know the circumstances, whatever investigative information is available at that time. Then if I'm able, I might review medical records if they're available at that time. And if I need to do x-rays, I'll get them performed and then I'll review those before I start the case. And then an external examination occurs where I look out external services, check out basic demographic information, hair color, eye color, notice scars, tattoos, any medical intervention if there was any, and any scars or trauma or any medical disease that has an external presentation.
So you start literally on the outside.
Yes.
And with all of that information that you've discussed, do you then proceed to perform an internal examination?
I do.
How do you go about doing that in a general way? Describe that for us.
With the assistance of an autopsy technician, I will eviscerate the body, remove every organ, remove any fluid that may be in a body cavity, remove all the urine. I will also have the head opened up and I'll look at the brain and the skull and see if there are any findings that are necessary to note.
Okay. And armed with the circumstances of the death, as best you might have them, as well as medical records, if there are any, and having started on the outside, performing your internal examination, what essentially is the goal, forensically speaking, of all of that?
The goal is to see what the body can inform me about what happened. It could either rule in something or rule out something else
All right.
that you're concerned about based on the scenario that you were given.
I'm going to use a term called differential diagnosis. Is that a term used commonly throughout all aspects of the medical profession?
Yes.
What would be a layperson's definition of a differential diagnosis?
So a differential diagnosis is essentially a list of potential reasons why a person is exhibiting certain symptoms. So based on the symptoms you have, only certain diseases or entity can be possible. And then it's basically ranked from the most likely to the least likely.
Would it be fair to describe it as a process of elimination?
Yes.
Based on what you see, what you learned, and what you learn in the course of your examination.
Correct.
And describe the process, if you can, at least in a general sense, of differential diagnosis. Given that you, based on all that information you shared, you've got several possibilities. How do you go about ruling in or ruling out certain potential causes for an individual's death?
If there is a scenario that has been proposed, I will look to see if it can be substantiated by the findings we have. Not every medical entity has a physical finding, but if I am concerned for it, I'll look for that finding in the body.
Okay. Might that process give you, again, in the course of your work, several possibilities ranked from most likely to least likely?
Correct.
And if you have sufficient information from all of the things you talked about, is the goal or hope to essentially arrive at a cause of death and the manner of death, ruling out other causes, if you can.
Correct.
Okay. Now, in terms of a broad spectrum of possibilities, once you've done all your work, would it be fair for us to assume that it can go anywhere from one end of the spectrum, being cause of death undetermined, to a cause of death within a reasonable degree of certainty, medical certainty in your profession?
Yes.
Okay. And is it something that occurs from time to time in your practice that you won't be able to determine a cause of death?
That's correct.
I assume likewise, there, in the course of your work, you are able to determine a cause and manner of death within a reasonable degree of medical certainty.
Yes.
Sometimes somewhere along that spectrum. Fair?
Yes.
Okay. I assume that ranking of potential causes would be based on all the information that you have received and all the information that you developed in the course of doing your autopsy.
Correct.
All right. I think I intend to explore the case of Ariana Hoffman, but but before I do,
Okay, Mr. Nelson, if you wish, you may inquire as to qualifications training.
Thank you, Your Honor. Doctor, just briefly, what led you to move from St. Louis to Tennessee?
Essentially, I needed a job that paid more with my family obligations.
Okay. I don't have any other questions. Thank you.
All right. Mr. Barnard, you may
Thank you,
continue.
Judge. Doctor, I now want to focus on the work, the professional work that you did specifically in conducting or participating in an autopsy on the body of Ariana Hoffman. Is that name familiar to you?
It is.
In what role or what capacity did you participate in that examination?
I was the attending or supervising forensic pathologist for this case.
Okay. Where were you practicing forensic pathology when the case of Ariana Hoffman was presented?
St. Louis City Medical Examiner's Office.
I'm sorry, say it again.
St. Louis City? Yes.
And when did that autopsy occur? When did you perform it or participate in it?
January 23rd, 2018.
Okay. Who worked with you, alongside you, or under your supervision in performing that autopsy?
Dr. Peter Williams.
And was he at that time a fellow in the program of that you were in as well?
Yes.
And would that be a position with the St. Louis University Medical School, or would it have been some entity other than that with which you and Dr. Williams were fellows? I'm trying to get that.
At St. Louis University.
Okay, all right. And they have, I take it, a relationship, or did, with the St. Louis City Medical Examiner's Office, whereby forensic pathologists such as yourself and Dr. Williams would perform autopsies in that office.
Correct.
Okay. What was your specific role in conducting that autopsy with Dr. Williams?
I would review the information with him. I'd assign the case to him, and I would discuss the plan for the autopsy, and I would be there intermittently to oversee the physical findings. I would discuss what we should do with the case, get more investigative information. I will go over the brain cutting when we had to do it later, and then discuss how we're going to rule cause and manner of death.
Okay. So in terms of the, I'll call it the laboring oar in performing this autopsy, who handled that laboring oar?
Dr. Peter Williams.
All right. As you sit here today and having reviewed your notes, did you participate in any hands-on way in the performance of the autopsy?
Just visual. I didn't physically do it.
Okay. And I take it that would involve essentially periodic visual observation of the procedure
Correct.
being performed by Dr. Williams?
Yes.
Okay. As well as consulting with him on any questions or path that your diagnostic road would take?
Correct.
Okay. Where did the autopsy take place?
At St. Louis City Medical Examiner's Office.
Let's talk about the procedure itself. Did it follow the general pathway that you've described for us in terms of the sequence of approach,
Yes.
including getting whatever medical history you could obtain, whatever medical records were available?
Yes.
Examination of the exterior of the body,
Yes.
then the evisceration or basically surgical entry into the body.
Yes.
Okay. Now, in this particular case, was there some history that was provided to you and Dr. Williams regarding what happened before Ariana died?
At that particular time, it's just that she was found unresponsive, and she went to 2 medical facilities before she came to us.
What would those have been, if you recall?
Blessing Hospital and then St. Louis University Hospital, or Cardinal Glennon, the Children's Hospital.
Is that the same or are those 2 different facilities?
They're under the same umbrella. It's a different name, but they're still St. Louis University.
Okay. All right. When was, as best you recall, and based on the information you have, Ariana pronounced dead?
I think the day before.
Okay. If we assume your autopsy was on January 23rd, that would have been January 22nd. Fair?
Correct.
Okay. Doctor, at the autopsy, when the body was open, let me back up. Based on your notes, the report itself, were there any significant findings on the exterior of the body that were significant to you?
Not significant. The only trauma I noted was from medical intervention.
Okay. When you proceeded, or Dr. Williams proceeded to surgically open up the body of Ariana Hoffman, what was noticed that was significant to you or potentially significant to you?
There was hemorrhage in the head, on the skull, and inside of the skull,
All right.
and on the brain.
Okay. Did that, based on the information that you had, trigger those possibilities that you would then want to assess and, if you could, rule in and rule out?
Correct.
I'm going to get into the specifics in a moment, but first, on completion of the autopsy itself, were you or Dr. Williams in a position to at that time, officially and finally determine a cause and manner of death, or were further studies indicated?
Further studies would be needed.
Okay. And what specifically were those?
So in this particular case, given the age and the circumstances we found, we decided to save the brain to cut at a later date. So that would take time. We'd have to do microbiology, histology, where we take section of the body and so we can look at it under the microscope. That needed to be done. And we had to consult and get more investigative information to see if we could figure out an explanation for what happened to her.
In addition to the eye, or to the brain,
And the eyes, yes.
based on what you saw at the autopsy, what parts of the body other than the brain were submitted for further testing?
The eyes as well.
Okay. Did there come a time that you received back those studies that you had requested?
Yes.
How does that work? Tell us. Who do you send tissues like the brain and eyes out to, or did you at that time, for microscopic study?
At that particular time, Dr. Miguel Guzman, who is a neuropathologist, he would review the brain cutting and the histology, the microscopic slides, to determine what happened. And we also did additional staining of those slides to determine whether there was certain findings to indicate what we were looking for.
Okay. Based on all of the information you had by the end of the autopsy, particularly areas of the brain that you described bleeding in, did you form an initial impression in terms of most likely to least likely?
At the end of autopsy, the findings were concerning, but I wasn't completely settled at that point of the manner, at least.
What findings were concerning?
The findings inside the skull and the brain and eyes.
I'm sorry. What were they concerning for, doctor?
Potential inflicted trauma.
Okay. Did you feel professionally in a position to make the call at that point?
No.
Okay. When, if your records reflect, did you receive the studies that you referred to, the microscopic studies, the stained studies back?
I don't recall the exact time, but it was probably a few weeks later.
Okay. If I were to suggest to you that the final report signed by you and Dr. Williams was sometime in late May or June, would you have any reason to disagree with that?
That is probably accurate.
Okay. Now, when you got those findings, the microscopic findings back, did you confer again with Dr. Williams with regard to any information that was helpful?
Likely, I think, but at some point I have to talk to him about the brain cutting and meeting with Dr. Guzman.
Did you do that?
Yes.
Okay. And as a result of that, did you and Dr. Williams come to a conclusion within a reasonable degree of medical certainty as to the cause of death of Ariana Hoffman?
Yes.
And what was that cause of death per the report of you and Dr. Williams?
Closed head injury.
Are we talking about trauma?
Yes.
Okay. Now, closed head injury can occur as a result of any number of mechanisms, correct?
Yes.
And based on the history, the information that you had, was there any indication in that history, or from any other source, of accidental trauma?
Not from the information that was provided, no.
Okay. And as a result of that, in addition to whatever else you may have gleaned, did you come to a conclusion and a finding within a reasonable degree of medical certainty as to the manner of death?
We did.
And what was, based on all that information, the manner of death?
Homicide.
Let's take a step back, because I'm going to want to ask you about your report. Specifically, Dr. Scantlebury, findings that were significant to you in taking you to those conclusions. There is, as part of that report, a portion of it called pathological findings, correct?
Yes.
Would it be fair for us to assume that those would be findings that were pertinent to one degree or another in leading you to that conclusion?
Correct.
Okay. Would it be helpful to you in describing your findings to at least have a reference to your report, a visual reference, so that you could go through those findings?
Yes.
I'm going to show you what has previously been marked as, next number,
14.
You recognize that document?
Yes.
It is a copy of the pathological findings listed, I think, A through H,
Yes.
attached to your report,
Yes.
your autopsy report.
Yes.
Okay. Again, would it be helpful in discussing the reasons for your conclusions to kind of go through those?
It could be yes.
All right.
Okay. We need it back.
I'm going to put these on the screen so that we can hopefully read
Before
them.
you do that, Mr. Nelson, do you have any objection to using this exhibit for demonstrative purposes?
No.
Okay.
See that? That's a little tough. Can we bring the lights down for a moment? All right. These are going to be a little bit difficult to read. I'm going to put your report in front of you so you, well, I can't do that.
I can read it.
So I'll read them for you, Doctor. Under Roman numeral 1 pathological findings, what does Roman numeral 1 say?
Closed head injury.
Now, A through H beneath that, can you read from where you are
Yes.
those findings? Is there any particular order of significance in those? Or does it kind of go back and forth?
I would say B, C, D,
D,
E,
E,
F,
F?
G, H. Essentially, A is the only thing that is pertinent, but is a sequela or consequence of everything else.
A is a consequence of everything that follows?
Yes.
All right. For the record, A is brain extensive hypoxic ischemic change within the brain death. What's that mean?
Because the brain showed evidence that the neurons were deprived of appropriate oxygen.
Okay. Ischemic. What's that mean?
Lack of oxygen or blood flow.
Blood flow?
Yeah.
Changes when the brain, causing brain death?
Yes.
Okay. Now, B is diffuse axonal injury. What's that?
That is when several axons of the neuron become severed, usually by acceleration or deceleration injury.
Okay. C, pons or brain pons multifocal acute intraparenchymal hemorrhage. What's that?
That's essentially finding blood where it shouldn't be, so it's not inside a blood vessel.
Okay. The parenchyma, is that the tissue in the cauliflower part of our brain, or the part that looks like a cauliflower?
Essentially, yes. Yes.
Okay. D, subgaleal hemorrhage left temporoparietal. What's subgaleal and where's temporoparietal?
So on the outside of the scalp, on the inside, that's the galea. And so it's under your scalp, over your skull, that's the galea. And sometimes it's hemorrhage there, usually by some kind of impact occurred. Either the head hit something or something hit the head.
Okay. Subdural hematome, subdural hemorrhage diffuse.
So subdural hemorrhage, this is bleeding that is, I will have to explain a couple of things. So This is bleeding that's under the skull, and there's a piece of tissue called dura. So the blood is under there, but on top of the brain, but over the subarachnoid tissue that covers the brain itself. So between that space is the subdural space, and bleeding can happen there depending on different reasons.
All right. Subarachnoid hemorrhage, diffuse.
So the brain itself has a very thin, transparent layer called the arachnoid, and if blood happens to collect under that layer and the brain itself, that is subarachnoid hemorrhage.
Eyes, which is G, bilateral extensive retinal and optic nerve sheath hemorrhage.
So there's a nerve, the optic nerve extends from the brain into the eyes, and at that connection point, sometimes around that nerve, bleeding can occur.
And finally, H, optic nerve diffuse axonal injury. What is that?
So the nerve itself, when you take histological sections, when you start seeing like the fibers, the thin fibers get severed, you can see axonal injury when they're after do a certain testing to determine that.
What's an axon?
I don't know. It is an appendage of the neuron itself.
Neuron is a nerve?
Yes.
Okay. So it's like
A
part of
smaller part of the nerve, the simplest unit of a nerve.
All right. And Roman numeral 2 is finding relative to the female reproductive system. Let me just cut to the chase. Was that particular finding significant in terms of cause of death?
No.
Okay. Let's describe the significant findings and how they helped you arrive at your final diagnosis or findings.
Can you repeat, please?
Yeah. The findings that were significant to you, the most significant ones, how did they help you in doing a differential diagnosis or performing a differential diagnosis that in the process of that methodology you ruled out other possible causes?
Okay.
What were the findings? How did they help you?
So all findings were significant, but the deciding factor was a diffuse axonal injury. So subdural hemorrhage can happen for various reasons. Same thing with subarachnoid, usually trauma, but how it happens. But diffuse axonal injury, there's a very tight window what could cause that.
Okay.
And with the scenario as given, there wasn't a lot to really rule in anything else besides what we concluded.
Being trauma.
Yes.
Okay. And again, diffuse axonal injury. Where in the brain would that have been found?
In the white matter.
In the white matter?
Yeah.
In one particular location or throughout the white matter of the brain?
Different locations, but it can happen anywhere.
Okay. But that is a red arrow to you?
Yes.
Okay. How about the bilateral extensive retinal hemorrhage? What's the significance of that in conjunction with all of the other findings? Particularly the nature and extent of that retinal hemorrhage.
Okay. So retinal hemorrhages, they can happen due to trauma, or it could happen something natural. So where we see the hemorrhage will kind of help you with the differential if it's more on the natural side or due to something more traumatic or non-natural. So when you look at the eye under the microscope, there are different layers of the retina. If you see it focally on one layer, it might not mean anything. And if it's on multiple layers, it might mean more torsional acceleration, deceleration might cause that kind of damage. Also, where the hemorrhages occur in the whole eye. So the retina is pretty much can go from the back of the eye to the front, just before the lens is there, where your cornea is, kind of. So if we see it closer to where the nerve is, it may be due to increased pressure, blood pressure, that could happen. But the farther forward it happens is typically not natural. It's something happened at, again, a car accident, have some extreme amount of force that's on their head or the neck and cause referred damage to the head. That can happen.
Okay. There are a couple of terms in there you used that I'm trying to recall for purposes of explanation. Let me take a stab at it. Did you use the term multi-layer?
Yes. Yes.
Okay. When you say multi-layer retinal hemorrhage, what do you mean?
Mean that you see, so say there's 9 layers of the retina. If you see it only on layer 1, that's okay. But if you see it on several layers, not even layers that are meeting each other, that's more concerning for some kind of head trauma.
Okay. Did you see that here?
I cannot remember. I haven't seen the slides in a while.
Okay. How about would looking at the microscopic
Yes.
report would help refresh your recollection?
Yes.
Okay. That's over here. Next number.
15.
15? Thank you.
15.
You show Mr. Nelson too.
Yeah. He's,
Yep.
thank you, Judge. For purposes of identification, I'm going to show you what's been marked as People's Exhibit 15. Take a look at that.
Thank you.
And Doctor,
Yes.
Rather than read from the report, if you take a moment to read it, and then when you're finished, just look up and I'll
Hand
let
it back to me.
And I'll let Mr. Barnard ask questions.
Okay.
So take your time to read it if you wish.
Yes.
Does review of People's Exhibit 15 for identification, the microscopic slide examination, refresh your recollection as to whether or not this hemorrhage in the retinas, both retinas, was single or multiple layers?
Multiple layers in both eyes.
Okay. Optic nerve sheath hemorrhage or bleeding. Again, what possible causes might explain that condition?
It could be from head trauma. It could be from infection. It could be some kind of hypercoagulable or bleeding state that caused it. It's various reasons.
What was it about the retinal or the optic nerve sheath damage in this case, particularly in conjunction with all the other findings, that pointed the arrow to trauma?
So the hemorrhage and the axonal injury is more suggestive of trauma.
Okay. I want to ask you at this point about another potential cause of the kind of findings you found in the brain, that being stroke, okay? Can infants of that age have a stroke?
Yes.
Okay. And is that something, if you see bleeding in the brain, you would want to consider?
Yes.
And are there basically two kind of manifestations of a stroke? One being a bleeding stroke and one being a blockage stroke?
Correct.
Okay. What do you in the medical profession or how in the medical profession you refer to as a bleeding stroke?
Hemorrhagic.
Hemorrhagic, okay? And how do you refer to a blockage of, basically a blood clot that blocks blood flow to downstream parts of the body?
Ischemic.
Ischemic? Okay. In a general sense, can you share with us if you have an ischemic stroke in any part of the brain, what typically are you going to see in terms of the nature and extent of brain changes?
In ischemic?
Yes.
So it depends on how long the stroke has happened.
Okay.
Initially, you wouldn't see anything unless you do a scan to check for the blood distribution in the brain. That's one way to tell early. But as time goes on, the brain develops changes. So brain will get softer in that area. There will be tissue loss, and it will also take up a different color than the rest of the healthy brain.
How about the distribution within the brain of that kind of damage from an ischemic stroke?
It typically follows the pattern of what that blood vessel was supposed to supply. So it would be kind of a web-shaped kind of infarct where, because it's kind of a tree-like system, so if that branch is cut off, whatever segment was provided by that branch will start to die.
Would you normally see those kinds of changes from an ischemic stroke in both halves of the brain?
Not typically.
And nevertheless, was that possibility, an ischemic stroke, given that it can cause brain damage, something that you considered based on all the other evidence that you have?
Yes.
And I notice in your findings and in your conclusion that you did not conclude that this infant's death was the result of a stroke. And what I want to ask you is how you were able and what information enabled you to rule that out.
The investigation or lack thereof, I didn't have any information that could provide a natural reason for her to have all the findings she had. And on a microscopic level, and additional testing, the diffuse axonal injury, the subdural hemorrhage, the optic nerve sheath hemorrhage is more indicative of inflicted trauma in this particular scenario, not in a zone, because it could happen if you were in a car accident or something like that. But I didn't have that. And in the absence of a proper explanation, knowing that she can't do this herself is probably at the hands of another person. So all of that together came to my conclusion.
You found in this case subdural hemorrhage, subdural bleeding, diffuse. Define diffuse for us.
Just means that it is not localized, it was everywhere, it's all around the brain.
And would you typically see that bleeding in that area all around the brain in a diffuse manner from an ischemic stroke?
Yeah.
I'm going to show you some photographs, and I'm going to mark them all now so that I don't have to come back and do that. Next number would be?
16.
All right. Run out of stickers, but I got most of them. Doctor, I'm going to show you what had previously been marked for identification as People's Exhibits 16 through 19 inclusive. Take a look at those. Once you've looked at them, I'm going to ask you a couple of questions about them. Do you recognize those photographs?
I do.
And were those photographs that were taken in the course of the autopsy on the body of Ariana Hoffman?
They were.
Do those photographs display or show the areas of changes in the brain that are listed A through H?
Yes.
Okay. And is there a photograph that actually documents one of the, either the left or right retina and optic nerve? I think that would be 19.
Just the optic nerve.
Okay. And 20. Now I'm going to show you 20 before we get talking about them. In a general sense, Doctor, would those photographs help explain your findings or correlate your findings to the conditions of the brain found by Dr. Williams and yourself?
Yes.
I would move for introduction into evidence of People's Exhibits 16 through 20.
Mr. Nelson?
No objection.
All right, then without objection, people 16 through 20 are admitted.
All right, Doctor, I'm going to put these on the screen.
And any objection to publication, Mr. Nelson?
No.
All right, then you may publish.
Thank you. Doctor, if you could...
And you want the lights? Yeah.
Thank you.
What
Yeah.
number do we have up?
That's 16. Dr. Scantleberry, in the process of the autopsy, did you remove the skull?
Yes.
And,
Yes, part of it.
okay, the skull cap, the upper part?
Yes.
And is that shown, is the part of the head shown here, shown after the skull cap was removed?
No.
What do we see in Exhibit 16 that's significant to you?
So in this picture, the scalp was reflected, and so we see the top part of the skull.
Okay.
And in the center portion where it's darker, that's hemorrhage.
I'm going to let you use the laser scanner. It's the right at the top, the vertical green line. I apologize.
Okay.
Can you see
Okay.
it?
Yeah, he's going to know. All right, so just to orient everyone, so we're looking at the top of her head. This is her left shoulder. This is her right arm. So this is the back of her skull. This is the front. And there are some sutures here. And then this area here is hemorrhage. And this is periosteal hemorrhage. This is hemorrhage that is stuck onto the skull itself.
Okay. Is that a normal finding?
It is not.
Okay. Was that essentially the first abnormal finding you noticed in the course of the autopsy in the brain area?
That and subgaleal hemorrhage, which you can't see in this photo, but it's here. It's present.
Okay. Where would the subgaleal hemorrhage be?
It should be in this area if the skin was still here in this area
All
here.
right. Now, next photograph. People's Exhibit 17. What do we see in People's Exhibit 17?
Okay, so the skull cap or calvaria has been removed, and you can see it here. And so you can see the brain now. And this is the left side, this is the right side, this is the front, this is the back.
Okay.
So on top of the brain, you can see, so if you can see this kind of white material here, that's the dura, and the redness here is blood that's under that dura. So that's a subdural hemorrhage.
Okay.
It's also on the brain, but it's harder to tell because underneath that, so when I said before, this little kind of see-through membrane here, that's the arachnoid. And under that, you can see here and there, under that is the subarachnoid hemorrhage.
How would you describe the nature? Can you see evidence of subdural hemorrhage on the brain surface itself?
Yes, I think here and there,
Okay. How many hemispheres does the brain have?
too.
And that appears to be visualized in Exhibit 17. One hemisphere would be at the top of the photograph, the other one would be at the bottom, correct?
Correct.
But if a person was standing in front of you, those hemispheres would be side by side, correct?
Yes.
Okay. And what's significant about this photograph that, in conjunction with other things, led to your ultimate?
The subdural hemorrhage and the subarachnoid hemorrhage are both diffuse and seen on both hemispheres and throughout the entire surface.
Would you normally see that with an ischemic stroke?
Not typically, no.
Okay. Now, next photograph. People's Exhibit 18. What do we see, first of all, in People's Exhibit 18?
So this is the skull without the brain. The brain was removed, and this is the front, this is the back, this is the calvaria or the skull cap kind of reflected over, and the dura is still attached. So it's also at the base of the skull. So all of that is all blood that was under this, like on top of here, because this is at the bottom, the dura is at the bottom. So on top of the dura, below the dura here, diffuse subdural hemorrhage.
As the brain tissue, again, I apologize for the crude description, the cauliflower-looking appearance of the brain, has that been removed in this photograph?
It has.
Okay. So we're looking down into the base of the brain?
Yes.
The skull, I should say?
Yes.
Okay, all right. And what is significant about those things you just mentioned that correlate to closed head injury?
The bleeding, diffuse bleeding.
Diffuse bleeding?
Yes.
Okay. Next photograph, People's 19. What structure are we looking at here?
The eye, I believe the left one.
Okay. And what do you see in this photograph
Okay.
that was significant to you and Dr. Williams and that correlate to your ultimate conclusion?
It's not pictured well, but to orient everyone, this is the back of the eye.
Where's the back of the eye?
This area here. We're looking at it from the eye from the back side of it. So you can't see the sclera, or not sclera, the cornea or the pupil. So you can't see that part. But here's sclera, this is some attaching muscles and soft tissue, and then this is the optic nerve.
Okay. What do you see around the optic nerve that was at least potentially significant to you when you did the autopsy and before you had the microscopic results?
So there's a thin rim of blood around the optic nerve.
All right. From this photograph, did there appear to be also bleeding or hemorrhage in the retina?
I wouldn't be able to tell it from here.
Okay. Now, what is it about the findings you just described in the left eye that correlate to your ultimate findings of closed head?
Is on its own not significant, but with all context, the bleeding around the optic nerve is concerning.
There is a small circular, very distinctly white area on the right side of that structure. Is that the optic nerve?
This?
Yes.
Yes.
And what do you see immediately surrounding it, ringing it, if you will, that was potentially significant to you?
Blood.
Okay. Is that optic nerve sheath bleeding or hemorrhage?
Yes.
Finally, Doctor, People's Exhibit 20. What are we looking at in People's Exhibit 20?
This is the backside of the right eye, and it has more soft tissue that you find. But this, okay, here we go.
That white
This is
circular
the.
structure you're pointing to, is that the optic nerve?
It is.
Okay. What is shown in this photograph that was potentially significant to you in correlating with your ultimate findings?
There was blood around the nerve.
Okay. Optic nerve sheath hemorrhage?
Correct.
All right. Don, if you would bring the lights up. Doctor, are you familiar with a condition of the brain known as cerebrosynovenous thrombosis?
Yes.
Okay. Tell us, what is that? It has been referred to by letter CSVT. What is CSVT?
So in the dura itself, on top of the brain, there is an invagination of the dura as it goes between the hemispheres. And where it meets, there's a tunnel called the sinus. And blood kind of goes through, but it usually is empty, or is supposed to be empty.
Okay.
So if you notice it, there's sometimes bleeding and clotting there. That is bad pathology.
Okay. Bad sign?
Yeah, not good.
Okay.
Not good.
Based on your examination of the brain in this case, did you, and in conjunction with all of the other findings, did you conclude that this child suffered from CSVT?
No.
And what was it, or combination of things that enabled you to rule out CSVT?
Not finding it. We found hemorrhage near it, but not in it.
Okay. In the sinus, in that tunnel?
Yes.
Okay. Doctor, a couple of final questions. If we imagine a spectrum in terms of your diagnostic possibilities, at one end of the spectrum we have cause of death undetermined, and at the other end of the spectrum we have findings that within a reasonable degree of medical certainty indicate this was closed head injury. Where on that spectrum would this case be found?
Closer to closed head injury spectrum.
Closed head injury?
Yes.
All right. Now, if we imagine a different kind of spectrum, at one end of the spectrum would be ischemic stroke. At the other end of the spectrum, findings that within a reasonable degree of medical certainty indicate closed head injury. Where on that spectrum would this case be found?
Towards closed head injury.
Okay. Doctor, my final question is this, and may sound a little bit strange, but it's the only way I can think of to construct the question. In your involvement in the autopsy of Ariana Hoffman, just your involvement in that autopsy, would that increase your income from your role at the St. Louis County Medical Examiner's Office?
At St. Louis City, no.
No. Would you being here today increase the bottom line in your income on your income tax return?
A little lower, but no.
Sorry about that.
That's okay.
That's all the questions I have.
Okay, Mr. Nelson, you may cross-examine.
Thank you. Doctor, I just want to be clear. Before the final report in the autopsy was signed by you and Dr. Williams, did you review all of the microscopic studies in this case?
Yes.
Or just some of them?
All.
All of them. Okay. And I think you indicated that the brain and eyes or tissue from the brain and eyes were submitted for further study. Were those the only tissues that were submitted for further study, or were there other tissues as well?
In what context do you mean?
Well, I thought that the question Mr. Barnard had posed to you was whether the brain and eyes had been submitted for further study.
So all tissue was submitted for histology, so we got microscopic slides on everything, but only select, I think, the brain slides and the eye nerve sections were submitted for immunohistochemical staining.
Okay.
I'm sorry, immuno.
Histochemical.
And what does that mean?
There's a special technique that you can identify certain findings by a staining method, so it'll be more illuminated, easier to find, and spot that you can't find just with the regular microscopic slide.
Okay. And what in particular would that type of staining help you look for?
Diffuse axonal injury.
Okay. What other possible explanation for subdural hemorrhaging is there?
There are other reasons. It could be natural. It could be due to a fall. It could be due to sepsis. It could be due to some kind of clotting issue.
Okay. And in this case, I think you said that there is a very, or what was the deciding issue in this case, was the diffuse axonal hemorrhaging. Is that correct?
Diffuse axonal injury.
Injury. Okay. And so what would the difference between axonal hemorrhage and axonal injury be?
One doesn't occur. Injury.
Okay.
Yeah.
So you said there's a tight window. What exactly does that mean?
So it's usually trauma, but it doesn't have to be inflicted. It could be in a car accident, but it has to have something with enough energy to be able to cause severance of the axon. And that doesn't happen trivially.
Okay. So when you're talking about axonal injury, you're talking about actually severing the axons?
Or damaging enough for its contents to leak out, yes.
Okay. And when you refer to this being a tight window, you're essentially indicating that there would be fewer explanations for natural cause for axonal injury than there would be for example, subdural hemorrhaging.
Can you rephrase your question, please?
When you use the phrase tight window, by that, well, let me just ask you, what do you mean by tight window?
The reasons that diffuse axonal injury happens is very few, and is trauma is usually the reason. How the trauma occurs may vary, but there has to be significant trauma to cause it to this level. But naturally, it doesn't occur.
Okay. So I think you said, never mind. Did you, obtain any cultures during this procedure?
I did not.
And did you observe anything during the autopsy that may indicate that Ariana had sepsis?
No.
You did not observe anything?
So sepsis may not always be infectious. It could be due to when she was having the issues with her brain trauma. Eventually, the body has problems regulating itself and goes into sepsis. But sepsis did not cause anything.
Okay. But did you see anything during the autopsy that could indicate that Ariana had sepsis?
Not in her body, but some of the findings could also be occurred in sepsis. But not all of her findings can be explained by sepsis.
Okay. Given the fact, so do I take it by that to mean that sepsis could have at least been a possibility in Ariana?
A possibility as a last term response or a last term action, but it was not the inciting reason for her having medical issues.
Okay. In that context, would it not have been prudent to obtain cultures from Ariana's body?
I did not in this case because she went to the hospital. With children, if they die at home or never got medical intervention, I would do cultures. But in this case, I knew she went to 2 hospitals, and they told me, and I knew at that time that she had gotten prophylactic antibiotics. So if she already has antibiotics in her system, when I took blood cultures or whatever cultures I had, the antibiotics would stop anything that, if she did have anything in her system at that time, it wouldn't grow because of the antibiotics. So I might end up with a false negative. So it's better not to do it because then you're not sure what to do with the result. If it's truly negative or is negative because of medical intervention. So I chose not to because of that. I wasn't ruling everything out. But I would depend on the cultures that were taken before she was given antibiotics. And those if I reviewed them, they were negative. And whatever, I didn't have anything infectious to explain all of her findings.
You did not observe any bruising on Ariana's body, correct?
Correct.
There were no fractures that you observed?
No. Correction. No bruising on her body, but in her scalp, yes.
Okay. And so, what is your belief as to the mechanism that would have caused this injury?
I do not know, but there was an impact site on her skull, so perhaps I'm not exactly sure how it happened, but I know it was a significant amount of force that caused the findings inside of her skull.
So there was not a skull fracture, correct?
Correct.
And so you're not certain whether this injury would have been caused by shaking, Ariana?
I would not go that far into making that declaration, no.
No other questions? Thank you.
Any redirect, Mr. Barnard?
2 questions. Doctor, I know you got to go, but
It's okay.
can sepsis, well, first of all, can you give us a working definition, a layperson's definition of sepsis?
It depends on the reason, but essentially, it is when the body is not able to regulate itself on the cellular level. So your blood pressure starts failing, and is not able to bring it back up on its own, and every function, every organ system is not working effectively, and essentially all your organs start failing.
Can sepsis be the result, the end result or end stage result of trauma?
Yes. Yes.
Okay. Were the findings inside of the brain, inside of the brain, underneath the dura, consistent with a shaking event that would involve acceleration and deceleration?
It could happen that way.
That's all the questions I have. Thank you.
Right. Anything further, Mr. Nelson?
I guess, Doctor, I'm a little confused. You're indicating that what you observed medically with Ariana was consistent with shaking or rapid acceleration, deceleration. But I thought a moment ago you just indicated to me that you would not go so far as to say that that was what you believe occurred in this case.
What I mean is I don't know exactly how the trauma was inflicted. And then unless I have any corroboration for that information, I'd rather not declare it.
Okay, thank you.
Nothing further, Judge. Thank you,
All right,
Doctor.
you may
are
step
released.
down. And she is released from her
You
subpoena.
are. Drive safely.
All right. Thank you, Doctor. Further witnesses?
I do, Judge, but that witness is going to be as
Long.
long or longer, thank you, Doctor,
Okay.
than this witness, and so maybe this is a good time.
Okay. Ladies and gentlemen, relying upon that, I am going to allow you to take your afternoon break. It is a little bit after 2. Why don't you plan on returning to the jury room at 2:15, and we'll get started shortly thereafter. As I must, I need to again admonish you not to communicate among yourselves or with anyone else. Don't let anyone else communicate with you. Do not utilize any means to do any research on any aspect of this case, any party to this case, any scene in this case. You rely solely on the evidence you hear in this courtroom. So with that, I'm going to excuse you and ask you to be back in the jury room at 2:15.
All rise. Session Circuit Court stands in recess.
People versus Travis Wiley. Mr. Wiley is present with his counsel, Mr. Nelson. Mr. Barnard, on behalf of the people. We're outside the presence of the jury. The jury is waiting. Counsel, anything that needs to be raised prior to summoning the jury?
No, Your Honor.
No, Your Honor.
All right, let's have the jury.
I'm gonna grab those off. Autopsy photos and the pathological findings.
Okay.
I'm grabbing them.
Okay, is this one you want to?
Not yet.
Okay.
I may, but not, I don't know.
Okay, I'll have it set right here.
Okay.
All rise. Session Circuit Court is now reconvened down on Michael L. Atterbury, Judge presiding. You may be seated.
Okay, the record should reflect that the jury has once again joined us, all 15 and the 3 alternates. Counsel, you may call another witness.
Thank you, Your Honor. People call Dr. Peter Williams. Dr. Williams, if you would go before the clerk and raise your right hand, please.
You do solemnly swear that the testimony you may give in the cause now pending before this court shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
I do.
You may be seated.
Come around, sir. And feel free to adjust that microphone.
I should go.
And I've been advised to advise all witnesses to please try to speak into the microphone and keep your voice up. So, thank
Okay.
you. All right, go ahead, Mr. Barnett.
Thank you, Judge. Would you please introduce yourself to the folks on the jury by telling them your full name?
I'm Dr. Peter Williams.
Dr. Williams, what is your profession?
I am a forensic pathologist. Also an assistant medical examiner for the County of St. Louis.
We have had the benefit, I'll share with you, of Dr. Scantlebury before you, who has described for us the field of forensic pathology. Can you give us, nevertheless, at least a thumbnail sketch of that particular specialty within the field of medicine?
Sure. So forensic pathology, basically what it is we do a pathology training and then a specific fellowship in pathology to determine the cause and manner of deaths. And this could be anywhere from an accident to an unknown cause to natural to homicide. So we're the ones that will determine how and why a person has died.
Okay. Are you a physician licensed to practice medicine?
I am licensed in 3 states.
And when did you obtain your medical degree? What year?
I attained my medical degree back in '98.
And where did you begin your, after you graduated from medical school, share with us the process leading up to your training, the beginning of your training in forensic pathology?
So after medical school, I did not go into the clinical practice, so to speak, right away. I did research, spent some years in research. I ran the cancer lab at St. Louis University Hospital for many years. And then I decided to go back into residency. I applied for my residency in pathology at St. Louis University. Was accepted and then continued on for my residency and then my fellowship through St. Louis University.
And what medical specialty was your residency in?
Residency is pathology. So
I'm sorry, go ahead.
So you get a residency in pathology. You do 4 years of pathology, specifically looking at the disease portions of the body. And then there's subspecialties you could go into. My subspecialty is forensics.
And how did you pursue forensic pathology? What was that path?
My background before that, I was also a firefighter in my town for many years. So when I got into pathology, I was still, I guess, an adrenaline junkie, so to speak, and I liked forensics as being the most active part of pathology, and continued with that.
How did you do that? What training or what training?
So, like I said, after you do your residency, then you go on and apply for fellowship. I was accepted into the fellowship program, and then you do 1 year in that specific only of doing autopsies, crime scene investigations, and determining the cause and manner of death.
Dr. Scantlebury has shared with us that those two terms, cause and manner, pertain to different things.
Yes.
Can you share your description of those two facets?
So the cause of death is actually how somebody died. Why did they die? Everybody has heard of a heart attack, a myocardial infarction. So if somebody dies of a myocardial infarction, a heart attack, that's the cause. That's what caused their death, or hypertensive cardiovascular disease. That's a cause. The manner is the circumstances as to what led to their death. In the case of hypertensive cardiovascular disease or heart attack, that manner, it's a natural death. So that would be the circumstances is how the manner.
Doctor, how far into your licensed practice were you when you went into the fellowship program in forensic pathology? How much time between your graduation from medical and starting into the fellowship?
Oh, it's continuous. Right after your 4 years of residency in pathology, it's immediately right after.
Okay. And how long a program is the fellowship?
It's 1 year.
Okay. Share with us, if you would, your professional path from the beginning of your acceptance into the forensic pathology fellowship program up to now.
So I was accepted to, like I said, the fellowship program. Spent the year St. Louis University Hospital and City of St. Louis performing the autopsies. At the end of my fellowship, unfortunately, there was no positions available in St. Louis. So I took a position in semi-private practice, so to speak, out in Pennsylvania. I spent 4 years out in Pennsylvania at a private practice doing forensic pathology out there with them. And then last year, I received a call from one of our forensic pathologists here and says, "Pete, I know you. We have an open position. Would you like to come back to St. Louis?" So I accepted and came back.
And what is your role, your professional role right now?
Right now, I am one of the assistant medical examiners for the county of St. Louis, the counties of Franklin, Jefferson, and St. Charles, and Lincoln County in Missouri. This is all Missouri.
And in that role is your core practice to determine cause and manner of death.
Yes.
My understanding from what we've learned is that one of the primary activities of a forensic pathologist is to perform autopsies.
Correct.
Because that's a vital component of determining cause and manner of death, I take it.
Yes.
Now, before an autopsy is performed, would a forensic pathologist such as yourself want to get as much information, as much baseline information to help you begin to form a list, if you will, of possible causes of death?
Absolutely.
Would that include, if it's available, history provided by family, caregivers, any witnesses to the final days or moments prior to death?
Yes.
Okay. Would that include, if available, records of medical treatment of that patient prior to their death?
Yes.
Okay. And would you use that in addition to the information you gather in performing the autopsy to begin to form the picture that hopefully clarifies into arriving at a cause and manner of death?
Yes.
Okay. How many autopsies have you performed since your fellowship began at St. Louis University?
Total, I've probably performed in the 15 to 2,000 range, 1,500 to 2,000.
Okay. Now when were you admitted to your fellowship?
2017.
Okay. If we assume that an autopsy that brings us here to this room occurred on January 23rd of 2018, can you give us a sense approximately how many autopsies you had performed up to that point?
Up to that point, it was probably in the 200 range,
All right.
250.
Okay. Doctor, I want to talk with you before we get specific about kind of the diagnostic approach you would take as a forensic pathologist. When you've got whatever information is available to you pre-death, you then, when asked to do so, will perform an autopsy, correct?
Yes.
All right. And in terms of the knowledge that you may obtain from that procedure, do you then add that to and consider that with all of that other information, history and prior medical treatment?
Yes, everything is taken into consideration.
And is it the hope, or at least the goal, to be able to reach a finding or conclusion within a reasonable degree of medical certainty as to why a person died and what killed them and why they died?
Yes, that is the job.
All right. Now, given that's the goal, let's talk about some realities. Are you, or has it been your experience as a forensic pathology, that there are times when you cannot, despite everything you've got or don't have, reach a decision or conclusion as to the cause of death?
There is, and that is why we have undetermined as a viable option.
So would it be fair for us to assume that in your work, at one end of the spectrum, you would have cause of death undetermined, and at the other end of the spectrum, within a reasonable degree of medical certainty, this is the cause and manner of death?
Yes.
Okay. Or perhaps anywhere in between. Well, it might be this, it's probably this, but it could be that, sort of. Fine.
Generally not. If I have a cause of death, that's going to be the cause. Otherwise, I would go undetermined. So if I have a cause within the reasonable aspect of my medical training and medical certainty, that is the cause.
Okay. When you perform an autopsy, has it been your experience that there will be times when you are not able to reach a firm diagnosis or conclusion as soon as the autopsy is over?
Yes.
And when you're at the point of concluding the autopsy, are you nevertheless at times able to form at least an impression or most likely cause?
Yes, I could always come up with a most likely cause, and then if I need to wait for additional studies that I've performed or will be performing, or medical record review, then that's what I will go and do.
Would another way to say that be that you would defer your final diagnosis or conclusion pending additional studies?
Yes.
I take it that's because you feel in your medical judgment those studies would be at least potentially helpful for you to arrive at a cause of death?
Yes.
Okay. Before I go any further, Dr.
Okay, all right. Mr. Nelson, do you have any questions for the witness about his qualifications, training?
Yes, Your Honor, just a couple.
Okay.
Doctor, at the time that you performed this autopsy, were you board certified?
I was not.
Have you testified in court before?
Yes.
How many times approximately?
About 3 or 4.
And have you completed just the one fellowship in forensic pathology or any additional fellowships?
Just the fellowship in forensics.
Your Honor, I don't have any other questions on this issue.
All right. Do you have objections to the witness testifying as to his opinions in this case?
I do object, yes.
All right. And what's the basis?
Based on the answers provided to my questions, certainly Dr. Williams has some experience, but I would assert that those qualifications don't rise to the level of an expert in this case.
Okay. The court is going to overrule that objection, allow the doctor to testify to his opinions in this case. Any objection in the court's judgment goes to wait to be given testimony. You may cross-examine if you wish and argue. At this time, Mr. Barnard, you may continue.
Thank you, Judge.
Yeah.
Doctor, I now want to turn to your involvement in performing the autopsy on the body of Ariana Hoffman. Does that case ring a bell?
Yes.
When did you perform that autopsy?
It was the middle to end of January
what
of
year?
2018.
I know that you and Dr. Scantleberry produced a report concerning that autopsy, correct?
Correct.
It's my understanding that that report was not prepared until some studies were concluded. Is that a fair statement?
Yes.
From your knowledge or review of your reports, what, in a general way, was the kind of information you were presented with before you began the autopsy? Let's start with history of the events, if you will. Did you have any information?
Very limited at the time, and then we got the medical records. We were able to review those right before the autopsy was to begin. Came up with a plan and realized that there was obviously no external trauma, so we were either looking at internal trauma or some other indication as to why this child had passed.
This was a 2-month, 3-week-old child, right?
Yes, infant.
What information did you have in terms of family or caregivers, that kind of information?
From what I recall, she was found unresponsive in her, I think it was a bassinet, after being put down, after being fed a bottle.
Did you have available to you any records from any medical facilities as well?
We had the record supplied to us from Blessing Hospital that came with Cardinal Glennon Hospital.
Okay. Who was involved in performing the autopsy based on the mechanics of the fellowship process you described?
I performed the autopsy.
And what role did Dr. Scantlebury play in the performance review of findings, et cetera, in that autopsy?
So she was my attending. So her and I, we would discuss the game plan, so to speak, what I was to do, and how to go forward. And then she would come in every so often, make sure everything was going well, and then came in at the end as well, from what I recall, to see the opening of the skull cavity and brain.
And did you, in the course of performing the autopsy, when she would periodically come to the autopsy room or suite, did you consult with her on what you were doing, why you were doing it, et cetera?
Yes, we would have discussions as to what was going on and if there was any abnormal finding at the time, yes.
And at the end of the autopsy, did you confer with Dr. Scantlebury with regard to the plan going forward?
Yes.
And what was that plan that you and Dr. Scantlebury decided?
After opening up the skull cavity and cranial vault and the findings that we saw, we were going to, or what we did is save the brain. The brain would be, instead of dissected at that time in autopsy and fresh, we would save the brain. It would be fixed in formalin for a few weeks, and we would take out the eyes, examine the eyes as well, put them in formalin for 2 weeks, and what formalin does is it fixes that tissue to make it very easily to be examined at an even closer level and dissected and cut. And this would go on and be evaluated amongst us, as well as a neuropathologist specifically trained in the brain.
At the end of your autopsy procedure, the external examination, the internal examination, and in consultation with Dr. Scantlebury, Doctor, did you form at least a tentative impression as to what the cause and or manner of death was? I don't want you to get into it. Yes or no is where I'm going.
Yes.
Okay. And would that impression have been the reason why you commissioned further microscopic and slide studies?
Yes.
What would the goal have been in doing those?
To leave very little, if no doubt, the cause of death was what we were going to sign it out as.
Okay. Now, let's go back to the autopsy procedure itself. Did you begin with an examination of the outside of Ariana's body?
Yes.
What remarkable findings, if any, were there?
There was no remarkable findings other than what would be considered medical treatment.
Okay. Like signs of
Venous puncture marks. I believe she had an intraosseous catheter. So stuff like that. It was just medical therapy.
Okay. Did you surgically open up the body?
Yes.
And at what phase in the normal course of doing an autopsy would you open up the skull and look and examine the brain? Beginning, ending?
Well, that's generally at the end.
Okay.
It's the ending part.
Okay. Before you got to the examination of the brain, at the end of the autopsy, doctor, was there anything that jumped out at you or not?
No, nothing.
When you got to the opening up of the brain, first of all, describe for us how you went about doing that.
So to opening up the skull cavity, it's called a bitemporal scalp incision. Basically what you do is you make an incision behind the scalp area, the occipital region from ear to ear, and then you would reflect the skin and everything back from the skull.
And when was the first time you noted findings or things that were of concern to you that were out of the normal?
As soon as we reflected the scalp, it was apparent that there was some type of internal injury to the head region.
All right. We've had introduced into evidence, Doctor, a number of photographs. I'm going to put them up on the screen for you, and I'm going to ask you some questions about them. I'm going to put on the screen what's previously been marked as People's Exhibit 16. And I think you may have a laser pointer in front of you somewhere. Maybe, I know, I've got it. Yep, I've got it. And there's a vertical green button. That's the laser pointer? Okay. Doctor, first of all, what are we looking at in a general sense in People's Exhibit 16?
So in the general sense, this is the inside of the scalp, so to speak. The scalp has been reflected back. You could see a very little portion here and then up here as well. So this is the posterior aspect. This is the anterior aspect, basically the front and the back.
So we can have a reference in the record. I think we can see the infant's feet toward the left
Yes.
of the photograph. Would the left of the photograph be the front of the infant's?
Yes, this is left, this is right.
And the right side of the photograph would be the rear of the infant's body, correct?
Yes.
And what are we looking at? What structure are we looking at in this photograph?
So now this is just a periosteal covering of the skull. The skull is right underneath this. In an infant skull, it's viable, it's flexible, it's not thickened like a normal human skull bone like you normally think of. And there's what we call suture lines. Everybody hears of the fontanelles, the posterior and anterior fontanelle. And then you could immediately see all this purple that goes down here. And this is a diastasis line here, and even in the middle, which appears to be separating, more widening than it should be, which is indication of two things. The purple that we see here, indication of hemorrhage, and then swelling is why the bones are separating even further than normal.
They're actually, you say suture lines. The skull is actually joined by some kind of like fibrous junctions, correct?
Correct.
And
So,
in other words, the skull is not all one solid dome, correct?
no.
And where those parts of the skull are joined by those fibrous areas, those are called the suture lines?
Correct.
Okay. And you pointed in that photograph to the suture line. Show us with a laser pointer where those suture lines
There's-
are.
Let's see if I can. There's one right here.
Okay, that coming down.
That comes
from the top of the
down.
photograph.
There's one in the middle, and then down this way.
All right, that's toward the bottom of the photograph.
So these don't fuse. They're not fused at birth. for the good reason that child's brain is not fully formed at birth. It's not the normal size it's going to be. It's got to grow. So these allow the expansion of the skull to grow with the brain. When the brain stops growing is when it fuses and becomes hard bone.
What was it about those suture lines that was significant to you, or at least potentially significant to you? I think you alluded to it, but help us with that.
They're wider than normal. I mean, even though I say a suture line, so think of it as intertwined like this, so it should be kind of close, which still allows for the sliding and growing. But with this, you could clearly see there's a space. It's not.
You were putting
It's
intertwining your fingers and kind of separating them.
correct. You could tell there's a widened space right there.
Is that of at least potential concern or significance?
Yes.
And what would the potential significance be?
Cerebral edema, the swelling of the brain, and expansion of a hemorrhage, a brain hemorrhage.
Okay. Now, has the skull been pulled back yet?
No.
Photograph? Okay. Nevertheless, can you see areas of hemorrhage?
We could see areas what indicates hemorrhage like this.
You don't know yet from this photograph what level that hemorrhage is at?
It's very indicative of the hemorrhage.
Okay. All right. Well, let's just further go down the road here. I'm going to show you what's been marked as People's Exhibit 17. Next photograph. And what are we looking at here, and at what stage in the examination of the skull does this photograph document?
So now this is the very next step from the photo prior, that we have removed the skull, and you could see this is the skull all down here.
On the right side of the photograph.
Yes, so here's the cut section going around the skull and how the skull is pulled back. And then you can see all in here the subdural, it's called subdural hemorrhage. The reason being is if you could see this, there's a lining right here. That's called the dura. So the dura covers the brain. And then you have a bleed in between the brain and the dura, and you get what's called subdural hemorrhage or subdural hematoma, in which you could see all this blood here.
All right, let me stop you there because, for the record, we kind of have to describe the specific parts of the photograph we're looking at. Before I ask you that, some very simple anatomy. In terms of the head, you got the scalp on the outside, right?
Correct.
Directly beneath the scalp is the skull, right?
Correct.
Beneath the skull is this fibrous coating of the brain called the dura.
Yes.
Okay, and beneath that is the cauliflower-looking part of our brain, right?
There's one more layer.
Yep, and I'm about to talk about that. And there's a very thin membrane over that cauliflower-appearing structure, so you can almost see through it, called the arachnoid membrane. Is that fair?
Yes.
Okay. Now, in People's Exhibit 17, has the dura, that fibrous coating, been pulled back and away from the brain?
Yes.
And where does the dura and the skull cap appear in this photograph?
At this part here.
That would be on the right side of the photograph?
Correct.
Inside that skull cap, if you will, and is the underside of the dura shown?
Yes.
And again, would that be basically the lining of the brain that is in this photograph still attached to the skull?
It is the part that is, yes, still attached to the skull, all this part here, the dura.
Okay.
Correct.
Now, what is it about the underside of the dura in People's Exhibit 17 that was significant to you?
The significance is there's a subdural hemorrhage and hematoma evident here and a little bit over here,
Okay.
but but mostly right in here. And you can see there's a big clot here as well, and all this is hemorrhage.
And that would be, I guess I'm gonna call it, if this skull cap were closed, that hemorrhage would be on the top and on the right side of the dural space, right?
Correct.
Okay. Let's go further in terms of what we're looking at. How about the actual soft tissue structure of the brain? What do we see and what was significant to you?
So now you could see, like here's a good example. See how shiny and translucent this part is up here?
You're looking
On
at
this
the upper left corner of the area of the photograph?
Let's say the 12 o'clock position of the, right in here.
Okay. In terms of the photograph, you're talking about the 11 o'clock position?
Yes.
All right.
Yes.
What is that we're looking at 11 o'clock?
So now you could see that's called the arachnoid, the thin layer. You have a P arachnoid and everything. That is the arachnoid space. That's actually really coating the brain.
Okay.
Okay, it's the next layer right before the brain proper.
Okay. Outside of, in between the arachnoid layer and the dura, do we see any changes that were significant to you?
All this.
And that looks to me like
This is-
darkened blood, but tell us what it is.
All hemorrhage. This is all subarachnoid hemorrhage. So it's the hemorrhage that's underneath that subarachnoid layer, the arachnoid layer. And that's why I wanted to point out how it's nice and clear and clean here
At the 11 o'clock?
at the 11 o'clock position.
Okay.
That's how it should be.
Okay.
Should not look anything like any of this hemorrhage over here that's
would-
bleeding into the brain.
A term has been used, the term being diffuse. What does diffuse mean?
So diffuse is it's all over. It's not one here, one here. So you could have focal's a spot right here. You could have multifocal, spot here, a spot here, a spot here, or you could have diffuse, in which it's just all basically all over both sides of the hemisphere, the right and left hemisphere, the anterior portion, the posterior portion. It's diffuse. It's all over.
And in terms of a clue, what kind of clue does that present to you in terms of cause of?
Some catastrophic event has taken place.
Okay. And that was going to be my next question. What does the appearance of that subarachnoid bleeding seen in People's Exhibit 17 that you've described as diffuse or everywhere, what does that tell you about the severity of the injury?
It's pretty severe. It's catastrophic.
Okay. All right. Anything else about this photograph, which is People 17, that is significant to you?
No, it pretty much shows everything I went over and talked about.
Okay. Let's move now to People's 18. First of all, what does People's Exhibit 18 show us? What are we looking at?
So now we're looking at the same thing that we did before, with the exception the brain itself has been removed from the cranial cavity here, okay? So
we're looking at basically the bottom, the underside of the skull.
the skull base,
Okay.
yes.
What is it that you see in People's 18, the skull base, that is significant to you or potentially significant?
So we still have, in the base of the skull here, subdural and hemorrhage still left over even after removing the brain. You can see it here, here, here. So it's still, the subdural hemorrhage is still there as well.
If we think of the base of the skull with the top of the photograph being the 12 o'clock position of the skull, the bottom of the photograph being the 6 o'clock position, we have subdural or residue or
Residual.
residual subdural hematoma at the 6 o'clock, 5 o'clock, and all the way from 12 o'clock to 3 o'clock, correct?
Yes.
Okay. What is the significance, or was the significance, or potential significance to you of that finding?
That there was definite injury at some point to the vasculature of the brain and the dura.
Okay. Finally, in terms of photographs, Doctor, I'm going to show you, I'll take it out of order so we can have some context. I'm looking at People's Exhibit 20. What are we looking at in People's Exhibit 20?
So this is, believe it or not, this is what the eye looks like when it's pulled out of the cranial cavity. So this is the posterior aspect of the right eye, because I labeled it as R. And at the approximate, say, 7 o'clock position, this yellow-white dot here is the optic nerve.
Okay.
And if you could see, surrounding this optic nerve is a dark purple band. That is a hemorrhage, that is blood. So there is optic nerve sheath hemorrhage.
What else, or what other findings regarding that rear aspect or posterior aspect of the right eye were potentially significant to you? Anything else?
Nothing.
Okay. And I think you just mentioned that there were findings surrounding that optic nerve.
It's hard to tell from this distance, but yes, if you see this right around this optic nerve, you can see how more or less bright pink this is, but right around the optic nerve is a dark purple-red band.
And what is that?
That is hemorrhage. That is acute hemorrhage.
Finally, People's Exhibit 19. What are we looking at, People's Exhibit 19?
So this is now the left eye, and it's the exact same thing as the right. It's the posterior aspect. The left eye was pulled out from the cranial cavity in the eye socket. Right here, once again, is the optic nerve, and then you could clearly see this coming around and surrounding the optic nerve is that deep purple-red band, which is, once again, hemorrhage around the optic nerve.
Were all of the things that you just mentioned, Don, if you can bring the lights up, were all of the things that you just mentioned, especially taken together, such that they gave you at least a tentative impression as to the cause of death?
Yes, along with the other negative findings of the autopsy itself.
Let me touch on that. You want to look at everything, right?
Absolutely.
You want to consider all possibilities, right?
Yes.
And those possibilities might manifest, be shown by other unusual findings.
Correct.
Were there any other unusual findings apparent on the inspection of the brain and the eyes, at least at the autopsy?
Other than the trauma I had mentioned, none.
Okay. Do you want to, and do you need to, at this point, at least consider the possibility of maybe some infectious process or some underlying condition that might explain a child's death?
So if I did, there was no evidence of it. Once again, medical records were completely negative for any type of infection. The autopsy showed no evidence of infection. There was no what we call lymphadenopathy, the swelling of the lymph nodes. If you have an infection, that's one defense mechanism that your body has, is to try and fight this infection, and your lymph nodes are swollen. They get enlarged, they're big. There was none of that. There was no evidence of meningitis as an infectious cause. There was no evidence of pneumonia as an infectious cause. There was nothing to indicate an infection.
How about like an underlying condition related to birth or an infant's growth pattern or anything?
Nothing.
Okay.
All organs, structures of the heart, anatomic positions of the organs, everything was normal.
Okay. I'm now going to turn, if I may, and one final look at the screen, Doctor. Do you have the pathological finding exhibit? I may have taken it from you. If I did, let me grab it. Doctor, when you completed the autopsy phase, why did you send out the eyes and the brain for further study?
The completeness of the case, confirm our suspicions. You can't see a lot, so even if you cut open the eye, it's hard to see sometimes the extent of the hemorrhage that we expected to see. So we fix it, and then we're able to look at it under the microscope and can really see the injuries that are there and quantify them as to where all these injuries are.
When you say you fix them, you mean you stabilize the condition of the tissue so that you can look at it later?
Yes, I'm sorry. When I say fix, I mean it's set in formalin. Formalin is our fixative.
Stabilizes the tissue?
Yes.
Okay. Now, how long did it take how long did it take before you got the microscopic slides back regarding the eyes, brain, etc.?
I can't give you an exact time, but it was probably in the area of a month, 4 weeks, because don't forget, like I said, we fix the brain and everything first, so that takes 2 to 3 weeks. We let it sit, really get firm and hard, and then we would cut the brain with the neuropathologist, and then that goes and gets sent to histology for them to cut. So it takes a good 4 or 5 weeks.
And would you, in that process, basically need to depend on the ability of the neuropathologist and those kinds of folks to examine and issue reports back to you?
No. Well, I mean, he's part of it, but when we do it with the neuropathologist, he cuts the brain, I cut the brain, we're cutting it together, we're looking at it together, we look at it under the microscope together, so it is still a joint effort.
All right. Would you have any reason to disagree with me that it wasn't until May or so that you got those laboratory studies back?
That makes about sense, yes. No.
Okay. Now, when you got those laboratory studies back, were you and Dr. Scantlebury comfortable, based on everything you had at that point, including the laboratory, the microscopic and slide studies, comfortable in determining within a reasonable degree of medical certainty the cause of Ariana's death?
Absolutely.
And what was the cause component of her death based on the information you had within a reasonable degree of medical certainty?
Abusive head trauma.
Okay. And specifically, were pathologic findings noted in your autopsy report that were pertinent to that?
Yes.
Okay. What was the diagnosis, finding, the conclusion that you and Dr. Scantlebury reached with regard to the manner of death?
Homicide.
And let me stop there for a moment. Trauma, closed head injury, is that what you would describe what occurred here?
Yes.
Okay. Closed head injury is trauma, correct?
It is trauma. The reason why it's called closed head injury is simply because there are no fractures of the head. So the skull wasn't fractured. So closed head injury basically means there's no fractures of the head is closed, but the injury still occurs within inside the cranial cavity and in the brain.
And trauma of that type can be accidental in origin, correct?
To a certain degree.
All right. Let's focus then, and in light of your answer, on the information you got from the family, caregivers, et cetera. Was there any description of an accidental event or anything unusual or untoward at the accidental end of things that would explain what you saw inside of little Ariana's head?
No.
Okay. Given what you saw in terms of all of the findings, well, let's talk about those findings before I ask that question. I'm going to put up on the screen what's previously been marked for identification as People's Exhibit 14. Don, if you could drop the lights for a moment. Doc, you see what's on the screen?
I do.
And is that the pathological findings component of your autopsy report?
Yes.
And there are two Roman numerals. What's the first Roman numeral heading?
Closed head injury.
What's second Roman numeral heading?
The female reproductive system.
Let's talk about Roman numeral 1 and the A through H subheadings underneath closed head injury. First of all, would the information shown in A through H subheadings be the findings that were pertinent to you in coming to your diagnosis?
Yes.
Is there any order of significance, or are they just kind of mixed in there in no particular order?
There's really no order of significance. You have to take all this into consideration as once. They are semi-divided, though, into like A and B is more a histologic findings as opposed to a gross findings with the hemorrhage and everything.
Histologic meaning?
I looked under the scope and came up with those findings. I looked at the slides.
Okay. And we've had some discussion of this before you got here, so go through those findings and share with us which of those pointed the arrow to closed head injury on this child. The trauma.
So the trauma with the closed head injury and the abusive head trauma is all of them. It's all taken into effect. It's all related together. The abusive head trauma will cause all of those findings.
Okay. I take it that some of those findings, at least in a given context, in a given presentation, could occur in non-trauma settings. Fair?
Fair to say.
Okay. Is it the combination of all of those findings in one setting, in one infant, what points the arrow to abusive head trauma?
It is the combination of all those findings, as well as the history, as well as the histological findings, the microscopic findings that we saw as well, that are indicative of abusive head trauma and trauma to the brain, as opposed to an accident or non-accidental trauma.
Let me focus for a moment on the G and H, starting with G, which reads eyes, bilateral, extensive retinal, and optic nerve sheath hemorrhage. Okay? What was significant about that in painting that picture that brought into focus that this was abusive head trauma?
So when you have abusive head trauma like this, and you look at the eyes, and you look into under the microscope, and you see all these retinal hemorrhages, Sometimes we say, what did I say, extensive. Sometimes we say too numerous to count. It just depends. Basically, what this means is there are so many retinal hemorrhages that they extend from the posterior aspect of the eye to the anterior aspect of the eye, and they are in different layers of the eye. Somebody who has an accidental trauma or a disease process does not have this extensive hemorrhage. They are focal, they're usually located to the posterior aspect of the eye, and they are not through multiple layers. So this is indicative of the head trauma.
Was there, particularly on the microscopic findings pertinent to the retina, multi-layer hemorrhage?
Yes.
Okay. Let's talk about H, optic nerve sheath, or optic nerve diffuse axonal injury. What is the, where did that finding come from? Microscopic? Or
So microscopic, that's a microscopic diagnosis as well, done with the neuropathologist.
What's the significance of that? And again, pointing the arrow to or being consistent with trauma as the origin.
So if you take those trauma together, it's very indicative, more likely than not, that this is trauma related. There's nothing really in the literature that's going to tell you all these layers and everything are from a different reason. There are other symptoms or syndromes, but the literature clearly depicts that those are located in the posterior aspect. They're not in all the layers, and you just take it all in as to how it presents itself.
In the broadest general sense, can retinal hemorrhage be the result of causes other than trauma?
It can.
Okay. And the specific features regarding the nature and extent of that retinal hemorrhage or bleeding is the number of them and the multi-layer nature of them that points the needle toward trauma?
Absolutely.
Don, if you could bring the lights up. Thank you. I want to ask you, Doctor, about a couple of different possible explanations for this presentation, these findings in the brain, okay?
Okay.
First one I want to ask you about is stroke, okay?
Okay.
Can infants of this age have stroke?
They can.
Okay. And there are two different kinds of stroke, right? One's a bleeding stroke. In other words, where a vessel breaks and you get bleeding.
Correct.
The other kind is damage resulting from a blockage,
Correct.
and the downstream structures suffer from lack of blood flow or damage resulting.
Yes.
Okay. Now, when you are dealing with an ischemic stroke, a blockage stroke, can you describe for us how does that present? What's it look like when you open up the brain?
When you're dealing with more so a stroke, a blockage stroke, especially in ischemic stroke, it's more so focal or multifocal, just a certain area. You might have a area right here, and next to it maybe another area, because that area did not get its blood supply. So it didn't get its blood supply, it died. It's not diffuse, it's not all over, it's focal in this one area.
From your experience, your knowledge, your training, your education, literature, would a blockage stroke, an ischemic stroke, cause diffuse subdural hemorrhage in both hemispheres of the brain all at once?
No. Generally what happens, the brain has a vasculature at the base of the brain. It's called the circle of Willis. Circle of Willis. And the brain gets all its vasculature supplied by that, and it branches off into all these different arteries. and that's what goes and supplies the brain. So just because you have a blockage of one artery or vein or whatever that's causing that one area of stroke, the other vasculature is not being or may not be blocked. So you still have the other area of the brain that is going to be perfectly normal and not be affected by a stroke or get a stroke.
Based on what you saw, particularly the diffuse subdural hematoma, were you able to rule out an ischemic stroke?
Yes, it's not that's not the presentation of an ischemic stroke, especially once we cut the brain and there was no gross evidence even of an ischemic stroke.
Were there any other findings that helped you, enabled you to rule out an ischemic stroke? Or was that it?
Just the presentation, the gross examination of what a stroke looks like, and that's not it.
Did you need laboratory or rather microscopic studies to rule out ischemic stroke here?
No. They just helped.
Now I want to ask you about a condition known as cerebrosynovenous thrombosis.
Yes,
It's a mouthful.
it is.
And I'll refer to it as CSVT.
It's fine with me.
Are you familiar with that condition?
Yes.
What is, in the broad sense, CSVT?
Basically, all it is it's a blockage within the venous system of the brain's vasculature. Generally, it's within the sulcus or the parasagittal side.
Sulcus. Can you help us with that? What is it? Where is it?
So, if you saw the brain,
I'll put it-
it was described as cauliflower-like,
Right.
right? So, and that's basically what it looks like, almost like a cauliflower. The difference with this brain is the cauliflower was not protruding. Okay, the cauliflower part of it, if it's my fingers, it's like my knuckles here. Okay, they were nice and smooth, and that's the edema. What's causing the swelling of the brain? There's not really that many ridges because the brain is swelling inside that cranial cavity. It's being pushed against the skull, and it's just being flattened and smooth. And then the sulcus is like in between. It's the dips. So like in between your fingers, that's the sulci. And if you looked at those pictures again, you could clearly see the bleeding around that's going down into the sulci, which is your subarachnoid hemorrhage as well.
So, what is it about that presentation where the bleeding goes down into that space, that sulci between?
So now basically it's tearing of the vessels, the vasculature in there that's allowing for the bleed to continue and expand.
What would you see in brain changes, brain damage as a result of CSVT?
You could see similar aspect, but you would have to have a different. There would be something that preceded this event as a different disease, hypercoagulable states. Basically, your blood is thick. A disease process. There was no disease process prior to her entering the hospital and being found in her condition. Now, CSVT also is associated with acute head trauma. Acute head trauma has been linked to and can cause a CSVT.
Did you even see any evidence of CSVT in this or anything that was consistent with CSVT?
No, even microscopically.
Based on what you saw and what you just shared with us, were you able to rule out, and to a reasonable degree of medical certainty, CSVT as a being involved as a cause of Ariana's?
Yes.
A term has been used, sepsis. You familiar with sepsis?
I am.
And give us your working definition of sepsis.
Basically, an easy definition of sepsis is a bloodstream infection. A bacteria or some microorganism has entered your bloodstream, and you become sick due to the overgrowth of bacteria within your bloodstream.
Was there any evidence of that either prior to Ariana's death or on examination in the autopsy?
No.
And what would you normally see or learn from the medical records or see in the autopsy that would be suggestive of sepsis as being involved in cause of death?
Well, review of the medical records, also there was no evidence of infection. They clearly stated it. Infectious disease was consulted, and they said no evidence of infection. There was PCR testing, which is a testing for viruses. That was negative. Her urine was cultured. There was no evidence of infection. The results are back. There were no organisms found. And autopsy would have shown, like I had mentioned before, at least some form of lymphadenopathy. If a patient is that sick and they're really getting ready to die due to sepsis or DIC, which is the final end of sepsis, you would have some type of lymphadenopathy, and there was none.
I'm going to go back one step. You used the term DIC.
That's called disseminated intravascular coagulation.
And that would,
Disseminated intravascular coagulation.
in that description that you gave to us, I want to focus on one finding that you did not see in the autopsy that would be a critical part of, at least as I understand, of showing you, or at least strongly suggesting to you that there was an ongoing significant disease process having to do with lymph nodes. Explain that to us, how the operation of lymph nodes as a defense mechanism would have revealed that to you if there was sepsis.
Well, basically, like I said, the lymph nodes would be swollen. As if anybody has ever had a sore throat, a strep throat, or they have a child that's gone to the pediatric saying, oh, he's got a strep throat, what's the first thing they do? They start feeling the lymph nodes all around the neck region. Well, I have something better because I can see the lymph nodes throughout the whole body. When I open up the body, there are lymph nodes all over the place, and you could determine whether they're usually like pea size, maybe bean size. Anything larger, once they start getting larger, or even matting together, growing together, and becoming larger, that's significant. We had none of that here.
Hey, Mr. Barnard,
Yes.
I'm going to allow the jury to get up and stretch. We've been at it here for about 45 minutes to an hour, so why don't we take a minute and stretch?
And if anyone needs to go to the restroom,
Okay.
I'm down with that
All right.
too, Judge.
Why don't we, how close are you to finishing?
Fairly close, actually.
Okay, all right. I thought you were.
Yeah.
I'll just give the ladies and gentlemen a chance to stretch, and the witness. And when you're ready to proceed, everyone can just take a seat. We'll finish up. Okay, I see everyone.
About the mechanism of injury that would produce these findings, okay, in absence of a fracture or external trauma. The term has been used, acceleration, deceleration, injury.
Yes.
What is an acceleration, deceleration injury to the brain that would cause these changes?
So this is when the head or the brain inside the skull gets moved around, shaken, so to speak. So you're going to go accelerate, decelerate, accelerate, and it gets moved around. Now, the significance in infants, as opposed to us adults that can handle it, are multiple factors. One, the weight of the brain in the infant covers about 25 to 30% of the whole body. Our brain weighs about 8%, okay? They don't have muscles in the neck to prevent that from going back and forth. The brain is also about 90% water at that stage, so it's really just sloshing around. In addition, the dura covering that we talked about is adhered to the skull, so that allows the brain to shake and move more as well. And finally, like I alluded to, the skull is still forming, it's still growing, it's not as smooth as a adult brain. So especially at the base of the brain, if you saw all those ridges, it's not as cushioned, it's not as smooth, and that's another factor that could allow for more of the sharing of the vasculature to get disrupted.
Shearing as opposed to sharing?
Exactly.
Now, you described the injuries to this brain as, I think, either fairly severe or severe.
Yes.
In terms of the effect that would have on an infant who has had an acceleration-deceleration injury, with the degree of injury that you saw, how would that affect, and how quickly would that affect that child's level of consciousness?
So there's really no way to say this child went unconscious within 1 minute as opposed to 30 minutes. So it'd be minutes to tens of minutes to an hour. You know, there's no really, you can't really definitively say. But there's obviously a time frame that this child did go unresponsive.
Yeah, and that was going to be my next question. Given the nature and extent of the brain changes, the injuries that you saw, would that have rendered, regardless of how quickly, would that have rendered this child unconscious?
Yes, at some point, yes.
Ultimately affecting all of the brain's functions,
Correct.
movement,
Yes.
breathing,
Yep.
heartbeat?
Yes.
Doctor, two final subjects. One, again, I want you to think of a spectrum, all right? In this particular case, if we begin with a spectrum where at one end we have cause of death undetermined, at the other end, cause of death within a reasonable degree of certainty to be this or that. In this case, closed head injury, where along that spectrum would this injury or this case find itself?
Closed head injury.
All the way?
Yes.
Okay. Now, let's talk about the spectrum being at one end either stroke or CSVT or sepsis. At the other end of the spectrum, closed head injury. Where on that spectrum would this case be found?
Closed head injury.
Finally, doctor, you get paid for being in this room?
No.
All the questions I have, thank you.
Mr. Barnard. Mr. Nelson, you may cross-examine.
Thank you, Your Honor. Doctor, I think you testified earlier that in your work, and in particular this case, it was very important that you have the broad picture and that you consider all of the records that you have available to you.
Correct.
Is that correct?
Yes.
And among those records are included all of the medical documentation in the case,
Yes.
including records from Blessing Hospital and Cardinal Glenn.
Correct.
And in this particular case, you did review all of those records. Is that correct?
The ones that were supplied to me, yes.
When you first began the autopsy in this case, what were the differential diagnoses in your mind?
Well, unfortunately, in today's society, one of them was an overdose. We've done several cases in which the child gets somehow the hold of medication. And then due to the history of no trauma or anything, just feeding and found in the bassinet, the other would have been some type of asphyxial cause of death.
Okay. Was there any consideration whatsoever to any sort of infectious cause of death
No,
or stroke,
no,
sepsis?
no. There was no reason to with the review of the medical records.
During the autopsy, you didn't obtain any cultures?
Did not. There's no reason. They would have been negative, or most likely, or contaminated.
Contaminated?
Yes.
Why do you say that?
The body is dead. The body had already received rounds of antibiotics. So it's clearly stated in the medical records that they had administered antibiotics already. So for us to go ahead and obtain further specimens that were not needed or indicated wasn't going to do any benefit to any of us.
In this case, you did review the microscopic studies,
Yes.
and approximately how many slides was that, if you recall?
Maybe 25, 30, somewhere along. I don't have the exact number anymore.
You would have received those at some point after January 23rd, or the date of the autopsy, is that correct?
Correct.
Because they had to be sent off to histology and processed.
Correct.
Do you recall what day or approximately what day you would have reviewed those slides?
No, I can't. Like I said, it probably would have taken 4 or 5 weeks.
Okay.
You know,
When you received those slides, how did you know that they pertain to the tissues in this particular case, as opposed to from some other case?
so they are all labeled. So when we take sections or slides, everything gets labeled. They're put in a individual cassette. The cassettes are labeled, and I also have a slide key, so I know which specimen is in which cassette. So everything matches up. The labels matched up with the slides. It's
So Ariana had no external injuries.
correct.
So that includes bruising,
Correct.
fractures,
Correct.
and I think you indicated that the only injuries that were on her body were in regard to the medical treatment that she had received.
Correct. I wouldn't say injuries, but yes, yeah.
So if the idea this case is that there was significant trauma, inflicted trauma, to Ariana due to some sort of rapid acceleration, deceleration. That would involve some sort of fairly violent shaking. Is that correct?
It would involve shaking. It does not have to be exceedingly violent. No, due to what I've explained about the brain and the water weight and it just being able to slosh around. So shaking, yes, does not always have to be very violent.
But it would have had to have been significant enough to tear the bridging veins.
Yes.
And how is it possible to even test this type of theory?
So theoretically, it is not possible. Okay, I mean, ethically, we're not going to take a child and shake them. So we look at a lot of retrospective studies that have been done for findings from individuals that have admitted to causing this harm, shaking the baby. And some individuals have only admitted shaking them 1 or 2 times and caused this amount of trauma. So the trauma, like I said, does not have to be extensive, or the shaking does not have to be extensive. The other thing that studies have done is they've actually used piglets that, quote unquote, were to best represent the anatomy and age of different infants, and shaken the piglets in studies to see if they could replicate these injuries, and they have shown that it is you could do that as well. So the studies are out there. It's reproducible. We just don't do it on, obviously, babies.
Reproducible in piglets.
In piglets and in with the retrospective studies, with all the confessions of how the injuries have occurred.
Retrospective studies where every subject of the study
Had confessed to shaking the child.
Correct.
Yes.
Bulls 14. Thank you. This was previously admitted as People's 14, and I think you testified that it was all of these pathological findings together that caused you to arrive at your conclusion that this was inflicted trauma. Is that correct?
Yes. With the exception of Roman number 2.
Correct, yes. So, letter A is brain extensive hypoxic ischemic change with brain depth. If we took that one away, would this be inflicted,
Yes.
indicative of inflicted trauma?
Yes.
And what if we took away B, A and B?
If you take away A and B, it is still inflicted trauma.
Proceeding on, if we took away A, B, and C,
Yes, you could still have inflicted trauma causing everything below that.
well, you could have inflicted trauma.
Yes.
But would you say that this would be inflicted trauma?
In an infant at 2 months of age, yes, that can't move itself. It's not crawling around. It's not walking or anything. Yes.
Okay. Next scenario, if we took away A, B, C, and D, would that be inflicted trauma?
Unless there is an underlying cause, another underlying cause of disease process, which we don't have, that can occur with other disease processes. But in the realm of Ariana, that we have no disease process or anything, then that would be consistent with trauma.
If we took away A, B, C, D, and E, would that be, could you say that that is inflicted trauma?
Same thing, yes. Without any other underlying cause to cause a subarachnoid hemorrhage that's diffuse without evidence of any other disease process, a child, infant at 2 months of age should not suffer a catastrophic subarachnoid hemorrhage.
So let's say we took away A, B, C, D, E, F, G, E, F, and G, and we were left with only H.
No. If you take away, I mean, you can't take away everything and not call it anything. But if you want to take A through F away and leave G, even G alone indicates abusive head trauma. If we had nothing else, G alone is very indicative, if not the indicative factor of abusive head trauma, which is also seen in my findings at autopsy and is documented in the medical records when they consulted ophthalmology.
So as long as there is hemorrhage in the optic nerve sheath, you can say that that is indicative of inflicted injury.
Well, you could say it's indicative. It may not be, but
Well, that's what I'm asking.
it's indicative. Optic nerve hemorrhage is indicative of abusive head trauma or trauma. It's also indicative of other things, but in this case, there's no other thing it's indicative of.
So I guess what I'm getting at is what used to be called shaken baby syndrome, what you're referring to as abusive head trauma.
Right.
Has typically relied on a triad of symptoms, correct?
If you want to use triad, that's fine, but it's at least relied on a cumulative symptoms, yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Historically, traditionally, if you could show that there was optic nerve sheath hemorrhage or retinal hemorrhage, as well as subdural hematoma and encephalopathy, with those three elements, doctors would typically diagnose shaken baby syndrome, correct?
I think more specific was cerebral edema, the hemorrhage, and the retinal hemorrhages. Yes. If you want to go with the triad, that is the triad.
Okay. So pathologists would rely on those three factors in order to say that this was a case of shaken baby syndrome.
I would not say rely on. They would take that into effect, or they would take that into consideration along with all the investigation that's gone on and the fact that there's no other cause to produce these symptoms.
Okay. And today you're telling us that as long as G exists, the optic nerve sheath hemorrhage, we know that that particular case would be inflicted trauma.
No, what I'm saying is if G exists in the extent that it existed in this child, all the research, the findings, both from autopsy journal review and everything, the extensive trauma that is seen in the eyes that was seen in this child is abusive head trauma. There is no other findings that show this in reproducible studies or any other disease state other than abusive head trauma. Every other state will state posterior aspect, it's not throughout the eye, and it's not multiple layers. So that is very indicative of abusive head trauma in and of itself.
And in and of itself, that would be enough for you to state that that is a case where on the spectrum that Mr. Barnard had previously referred to, that's enough to push you all the way to the one end of this is within a reasonable
It
degree of
would
medical-
lead me towards that end a lot. Yes, it would lead me towards that end, not as I would take all that into effect, but it would lean me towards that, yes.
No other questions, thank you.
All right. We can have the lights back on. Redirect examination, Mr. Barnard.
Thank you, Judge. Doctor, I want to talk to you about something that counsel raised, and that's the role that I guess I would describe as confessional evidence plays in diagnosing abusive head trauma where someone has not confessed. Okay? Now, if that is kind of the backdrop, let me ask you this question. In your experience getting historical information from caregivers, when you have findings that you have here that lead you to the conclusions you've made, would the lack of a confession dissuade you from those findings?
No.
And that leads me to my next question. When you have findings, let's say of the type we've got here, and a person has confessed in a given case, has confessed, is that combination of things, the confession and the specific findings, helpful to you in forming opinions when they haven't confessed?
My findings are based on my factual evidence at autopsy. If somebody confesses, that's their option. That has nothing to do with me. That has nothing to do with my findings at autopsy. It will not persuade me one way or the other as my findings show me.
And I'm trying to process in my own brain, when you've got that particular component of the big picture, and you look at a number of cases where there's both a confession and these findings, is that significant to you in any way of telling you that these findings, in absence of a confession, correlate to abusive head trauma?
In the absence of a confession.
Yeah, let me withdraw that. I'm going to make one more stab at it before I give up. Okay.
So, I mean, if I have these findings,
Okay, hang on just
Let
a
me
second.
try this.
Counsel, be very careful.
Yeah,
here.
I will, Judge.
You're treading close to some
Yeah.
improper.
Right, but let's say in a given case, not this one, you've got the kind of findings you've got in this case. And someone says, well, yeah, I shook the baby. seems to me that that kind of history correlates to those kind of findings.
Yes.
And so it can, at least in certain cases, explain those findings or be additional confirmation of those findings.
Yes, I would agree with that.
So when you have those findings, without a confession, does it rule out your conclusion?
No.
Okay. I guess, put it finally in another way, do you have to have a confession to make this diagnosis?
No.
Thank you.
Okay. Additional questions, Mr. Nelson?
No, thank you.
Okay, doctor, you may step down. Is Dr. Williams released from subpoena?
Yes.
And
Yes. Thank you, doctor.
Mr. Nelson, is Dr. Williams released?
Yes.
Okay, thank you, doctor.
Thank you.
Yep. As Dr. Williams makes his way out, Mr. Barnard, my question is, do you have a witness who would be relatively short?
I do.
Okay.
And that would be to recall Officer Towdy.
Okay, you may do so.
Let me revise that to say I thought I did.
Okay.
I'm sorry, did you call a witness?
Yes, Kevin Towdy.
Okay. Ladies and gentlemen, do you need a break before we hear from our last witness of the day? Okay, I'm hearing yes. So
I saw a yes.
Why don't we take a 10-minute break? Okay, the record should reflect that the 12 members of the jury, the 3 alternate jurors, are all present in the courtroom. I believe Mr. Barnard has just gone out to retrieve his witness. So we'll pause just a second for him to return with his witness. Okay. Mr. Barnard is now back. You may call a witness.
People recalled Officer Kevin Towdy.
Okay.
You do solemnly swear that the testimony you may give in the cause now pending before this court shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
Yes.
You may proceed.
Yeah, officer, if you could take a moment here to catch your breath. Okay, all right. And if you would, please speak into the microphone and keep your voice up. We've had a little problem today with our witnesses speaking loudly enough.
Okay.
I've advised the attorneys, and I myself am trying to do that, so you're not alone. So, Mr. Barnard, sir, you may inquire when you're ready.
Thank you, Judge.
You're welcome.
Officer Towdy, you recall this. One of the subjects of your testimony yesterday was a court-authorized recording of a conversation involving a person believed to be Travis Wiley and a woman by the name of Alyssa Donnelly. You recall that?
I do.
Okay. Now, in the course of the investigation, have you had occasion to interview Travis Wiley face to face
I have.
and hear his voice?
Yes.
And how many of those in-person conversations did you have either in the course of an interview or other conversations at other places face to face?
Would have been at the scene that night in the interview room, and then on June 30th on that interview. So 3 separate encounters.
Okay. And in addition to that, have you listened to phone conversations when you knew based on the circumstances that one of the parties to that conversation was in fact Travis Wiley?
Yes.
And from those conversations, were you able to develop a familiarity with his voice?
Yes.
And based upon that familiarity, were you able to identify the voice heard on that court-authorized overhear recording
Yes.
that you knew to be Travis Wiley?
Yes.
Okay. Your Honor, I would at this time, subject to any objection or any further discussion, intend to ask questions about that recorded conversation.
Of Officer Towdy.
Of Officer Towdy,
Okay.
of the voice,
And,
the overheard conversation.
Help me, counsel. Did Officer Towdy testify that he had listened to that audio recording?
I think I did yesterday. I'm almost certain I did, but let me re-ask
Okay.
it. Just, Officer Towdy, just for the record and to confirm, after that court-authorized recording occurred, did you either download or obtain the recording from Alyssa Donnelly?
We did.
And did you proceed to listen to it?
Correct.
And based on your comparison of the male voice in that conversation, were you able to make an identification based on your answers to the questions that I just asked you?
Yes.
Okay. And who was the male voice based on all of the questions I've asked you in that recorded, court-authorized, overheard conversation?
Travis Wiley.
Okay. So Mr. Nelson, Mr. Barnard has indicated he wishes to get into the contents of that conversation. Before he does that, if you have questions you wish to ask, I know you objected yesterday, so I want to give you the opportunity to ask questions before Mr. Barnard changes topics here.
Thank you, Your Honor. I don't have any questions
Okay.
at this point.
All right. At this time, then, the court, there was an objection made as to the authenticity of the identification of the male voice on the overheard conversation. The court at this time is going to overrule that objection, and I will allow Mr. Barnard now to get into the contents of that conversation.
Thank you. Officer Towdy.
And Mr. Barnard, I'm sorry to interrupt you. If you would, for the record, ask the officer to identify the other party to the conversation.
Before I ask you about the substance of the conversation, based on all the circumstances you testified to yesterday, who was the other party to the conversation in addition to the voice you identified as Travis Wiley?
Female named Alyssa Donnelly.
Okay, so in that recorded conversation, it was a female and a male, correct?
Yes,
Female is Alyssa Donnelly, male is Travis Wiley.
that is correct.
Now, I want to ask you about only two specific statements made by Travis Wiley in that conversation. And if you haven't reviewed your report, I can share it with you. Do you need to review your report to refresh your recollection about the specific statement made?
Specifically, I remember the words. If I'm going to if you're asking me to quote it verbatim, I would have to look at the report, but I do know on a general sense what he did say.
Let me start with your general, your recollection. And I want to first focus on a statement made that was triggered by a question from the female voice as to that was in substance is the only thing holding you here your pending case. Do you recall the response to that question?
I believe so, yes.
Would it help you be more specific if you reviewed your report?
To quote it exactly, yes.
Okay. Show Mr. Nelson. And is it marked already, counsel?
Your Honor, I thought yes, it is marked for identification as People's Exhibit 7. Let me share that with you as People's Exhibit for identification 7, page 10 of 13, and going on to page 14.
And officer, rather than read from your report, if you'll take a minute just to review it, and then when you've had a chance to read it, you could look up.
Yes, sir.
Okay.
Yes, to go ahead and answer that question.
Yeah, what was the response triggered by the question, is your pending case the only thing holding you here?
He said, "This is not holding me here. Where I am going, there is no extradition."
The other statement that I want to ask you about is one which did not appear to be triggered by a question, but came in the course of a conversation, that same conversation, with regard to that same issue of extradition. Do you recall that specific statement made?
Yes.
And what was that statement?
I have to get out of this town. I am not worried about going to jail. Where I'm going, there's no extradition.
That's all the questions I have.
Mr. Nelson, you may cross-examine Officer Taddy.
Officer, I'll be very brief. Mr. Wiley was in fact arrested here in Adams County, correct?
Correct.
And that was within what time frame of when these statements would have been made?
So the exact statements would have been made on May 22nd. He was arrested in the late hours of June 29th.
Okay. No further questions. Thank you.
Any further question based on that, Mr. Barnard?
No, Your Honor.
All right, Officer Taddy, sir, you may step down. And is Officer Taddy now released from
He
his
is.
subpoena? Is that,
Yes, sir.
all right, officer, you are released. Okay. All right, ladies and gentlemen, that is going to conclude our day of evidence. We will, again tomorrow, begin evidence at 9 a.m. If you would please gather in the jury room at 8:45, that would be sufficient. Before you go home, let me, for the last time today, you should not do any independent investigation or research on any subject or person relating to the case. What you may have seen or heard outside the courtroom is not evidence. This includes any press, radio, television programs, and it also includes any information on the internet. Such programs, reports, and information are not evidence, and your verdict must not be influenced in any way by any such material. For example, you must not use the internet, Google, Wikipedia, or any other sources that you might otherwise use to search for any information about the case or the law which applies to this case, or the people involved in the case, including the defendants, witnesses, lawyers, and judge. During the course of the trial, do not communicate with or provide information personally in writing or electronically to anyone about this case, not even your own families or friends, courtroom personnel, and also not even among yourselves until instructed otherwise. You must not provide any information about the case to anyone by any means at all, and this includes posting information about the case or your thoughts about it on any device or internet site, including blogs, chat rooms, or any social networking websites such as Twitter, Facebook, or any other means. You cannot use any electronic devices or services to communicate about this case, including cell phones, smartphones, laptops, the internet, and any other tools of technology. The use of any such devices or services in connection with your duties is prohibited. With that, ladies and gentlemen, you are excused until tomorrow morning at 8:45.
All right.
I wish you a good evening.
You too.
Okay, you all may be seated. And the record should reflect that the jury has all now exited the room, including the alternates, and the door is closed. Counsel are still present. Mr. Wiley is still present. Counsel, I know yesterday I mentioned that we could do a preliminary jury instruction conference without a court reporter this evening. Is that still something the two of you are prepared to do?
Let me do, if I may, Judge, can I
Yes.
propose an option?
Okay.
Unless something has changed with regard to Dr. Turner's availability, which I understand to be Friday,
Yes.
we're going to have a lot of time tomorrow. After the testimony of Dr. Petrak, I would not expect that her testimony would involve more than half a day. And as such, we would have plenty of time tomorrow, unless Dr. Turner's schedule has changed. And given that it's the end of the day,
Okay.
I would throw that option out there as being equally productive and less taxing.
Okay.
to me.
Well, two things. First off, Mr. Nelson, about the jury instruction conference.
And that's what I'm speaking of.
Yeah, no, I know. And then you also raised Dr. Turner's schedule, which is somewhat different from what we spoke about yesterday. But first off, about the jury instruction conference.
Your Honor, I could do it either way. I could do it tonight, I could do it
Tomorrow.
later. I would tell the court, Dr. Turner is available tomorrow afternoon, but she is also available Friday. So,
Well, here's my thought. As between giving the jury the case Friday afternoon versus late Friday morning, the court's preference would be late Friday morning, which I guess would suggest that if Dr. Turner is available tomorrow afternoon, I would prefer that. And it's still the intent of the state to rest after Dr. Petrak. And that's thought to be by noon. Am I correct?
I believe so, yes.
Okay.
And given what Mr. Nelson's just shared, I'm good with doing the informal conference now.
I don't think it'll take us long.
I don't either.
So, Mr. Nelson, is that schedule okay with the defense?
yes,
Okay.
I will need to run up to my office to get the instructions.
Okay. So with that, Mr. Wiley can remain in the courtroom. Okay, let me ask this before you go. Do you want Mr. Wiley to be present? Does Mr. Wiley want to be present during the informal conference? You want to talk to him about that?
Yes.
He must be present during the formal conference. Yeah.
Did you find your cap?
I haven't yet. I've got two other ones, so. But it's got to be here somewhere. That's what's got me confused, right? 'Cause
Your Honor, Mr. Wiley does wish to be present for the informal.
Okay, okay.
Muddy River News. Our home, our news.